a man sailing alone in open ocean, a leopard fighting for its life, miles from the nearest shore. What brought the two together in the middle of nowhere stunned scientists, challenged everything we know about animal survival, and ended in something so extraordinary, it's still being studied to this day. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. We bring you powerful, emotional wildlife stories based on real behaviors, real field accounts, and unforgettable bonds. The sun hung low over the Indian Ocean, painting the water in streaks of gold. 39-year-old Thomas Avery had been sailing solo for 7 days, en route from Madagascar to Kenya aboard his 38-foot cutter-rig sloop, the Maria. A seasoned sailor, Thomas had crossed oceans, braved squalls, and once even rescued a drifting fishing boat off the Seychelles. But nothing could have prepared him for what he saw that evening. It was just past 6 p.m., and Thomas had been scanning the horizon out of habit when he noticed a shape in the water, not far off the port bow. At first, he assumed it was a seal, maybe a floating log. But then it moved against the current. He grabbed his binoculars. What he saw made his stomach twist. A spotted animal, powerful, struggling, its eyes barely above the surface. The strokes were strong but slowing. Its body was sleek, long-limbed, tail trailing like a rudder. A leopard. Thomas blinked hard, lowered the binoculars, and looked again. There was no mistake. A full-grown leopard, in the middle of the ocean, at least 135 miles from the nearest land. He cursed softly and sprang into action. There was no time to figure out how or why it was there, only that it wouldn't last long. He turned the rudder, starting the engine to navigate closer. As he approached, he could see its exhaustion. The animal was barely keeping its head up, body beginning to slump with every stroke. "No way you made it this far," he murmured. "What the hell happened to you?" He slowed the boat beside the leopard. It didn't hiss, didn't growl. It just floated. Its eyes locked on his. Not wild with fear, not aggressive, just tired. Without thinking, Thomas pulled the rescue sling from the stern, a nylon loop designed for man-overboard situations. He lowered it and tried to angle it near the cat, careful not to get too close. To his shock, the leopard moved into it. It knew, it let him pull, and within minutes, soaked and trembling, the leopard was on board. It collapsed onto the deck, chest heaving, claws retracted. It didn't move. It didn't try to attack. It trusted him. Thomas stared down at the animal, water dripping around both of them. Whatever this was, it was just the beginning. The deck of the Maria was slick with salt water. The leopard lay motionless, its ribs rising and falling in rapid bursts. Its golden coat, soaked and heavy, clung to the lean muscles underneath, each breath a quiet struggle for life. Thomas stood a few feet away, rope still in hand, heart pounding. He expected the leopard to spring up, to lunge, to revert to the instincts it had been born with. But it didn't. It didn't even lift its head. It just stared at him. Its eyes were open, wide, alert, but not wild. They didn't dart around in panic. They fixed on his, unblinking. And what Thomas saw in them wasn't aggression. It was pleading. And it shattered him. He grabbed a canvas tarp from the storage bin and approached, slowly, knees slightly bent, ready to retreat if the animal showed any sign of resistance. But it didn't move. As gently as he could, he draped the tarp over the leopard, shielding it from the wind. Then he knelt just outside the reach of its front paws. "How are you alive?" he whispered. The leopard blinked once, slowly, then dropped its head onto the deck. Not from fear, from exhaustion. Thomas examined the animal as best he could. It was a female, full-grown. No signs of immediate wounds, but her hind leg was trembling, possibly from a cramp or pulled muscle. Salt crusted around her whiskers and eyelids. He opened the cooler and retrieved a small bowl. Carefully, he filled it with fresh water from the cabin tank and slid it near her mouth. She didn't move. He took a step back. She lifted her head and drank. Long, slow laps of her tongue. Thomas exhaled hard. Unbelievable. He checked the GPS. They were 135 nautical miles from the nearest landfall, somewhere between Nosy Be and the Somali Current. The ocean here was deep, with no reef systems, no sandbanks. This leopard hadn't swum from shore. She had either fallen from something or had been intentionally dumped. The thought made his stomach twist. He went below deck and retrieved a bag of smoked fish, the only protein he had on board aside from emergency rations. When he returned, she was still there, lying under the tarp, breathing a little easier. He tossed a piece of fish toward her. She sniffed it, ate it, slowly. Then, her eyes met his again. And he did something no sane person should have done. He sat down, right there a few feet from a wild predator. And the leopard closed her eyes, not from pain, but trust. The Indian Ocean stretched endlessly around them. But for one impossible moment, predator and man shared something older than fear. A will to survive, together. That night, the stars poured across the sky like spilled salt. The waves gently lapped against the hull of the Marea, the ocean unusually calm, as if it too was holding its breath. Thomas sat in the cockpit, flashlight in one hand, logbook in the other, but his eyes kept drifting back to the deck where the leopard lay. She hadn't moved since sundown, but her breathing was steadier now, slower, rhythmic. It was impossible to sleep. He had radioed a distress report on an open frequency earlier, logging the coordinates and describing the situation without much hope anyone would respond. Out here, you were more likely to catch pirate chatter than aid from a rescue team. So he started tracing the event backward, replaying everything. How did a leopard end up 135 miles offshore? There were no islands, no natural cause that made sense. Then, just past midnight, he remembered something, barely a flash, in the fog of the past days. 3 days earlier, at sunrise, he'd passed a cargo vessel, huge, rusting, no national markings, moving slower than it should have been. He remembered how he'd waved and received no wave in return. Just men on deck, watching. He remembered cages. At the time, he thought they were for dogs or poultry. But what if they weren't? He raced below deck, digging through his camera bag. He always took zoom shots of passing ships, just in case. A habit from years working with marine conservationists. He found the memory card, popped it into his tablet, and pulled up the images. There, 4 cages. And in one, something with spots, not dogs, not goats, cats, wild cats. His throat went dry. Somewhere along that ship's journey, someone had likely dumped the animals. Maybe one had gone feral on board. Maybe it became a liability. Or maybe, as twisted as it sounded, someone thought it would be fun to toss a leopard into the sea and watch. And only one survived. He looked toward her again. She hadn't moved, but her eyes were open now, watching him. They weren't wild, not fully, not like a jungle-born leopard. No, this one had known cages, bars, maybe even people. She had been discarded. A living, breathing creature, thrown away like cargo. Thomas felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the night air. "You're not just a miracle," he murmured, voice shaking. "You're a survivor of something horrible." The leopard blinked, and in that second, he realized he couldn't drop her off at some coastal facility. He couldn't let her end up in another cage. If she trusted him enough to climb aboard his boat, then maybe, just maybe, she deserved something more. The following morning, the ocean had turned restless. Low clouds smeared the sky like bruises, and wind whipped across the Morea's deck as Thomas adjusted the mainsail. He kept glancing behind him at the tarp-covered form of the leopard, still curled against the cabin wall. She hadn't attacked. She hadn't fled. But Thomas knew her calm couldn't last forever. She was still a wild animal. One wrong move, one accidental bump, or loud noise, and the fragile trust between them could shatter. As he turned back to the helm, he whispered under his breath, "I need to figure this out before we hit shore." But where would he even take her? He had no contacts in wildlife rehab, no transport crates, no permits, and more urgently, what would authorities do if he arrived in port with a leopard on board? Best case, they'd seize her. Worst case, they'd euthanize her. She stirred behind him. Thomas froze, hand on the wheel. He turned slowly and saw her rise, limping, unsteady, but upright. Her muscles trembled with the effort. Her paws patted softly over the damp wood of the deck as she stepped forward. He watched, heart pounding, as she walked past him and lay at his feet just like that, as if to say, "I choose this spot." Thomas swallowed hard. The swell of the ocean rocked them both slightly, and she didn't even flinch. He reached down, cautiously, letting his hand hover just above her back. Still, she didn't move. With a breath held tight, he lowered his fingers, touched her. Her fur was damp and gritty with salt. Her skin twitched once beneath his palm, but she didn't recoil. He gently ran his hand down her shoulder. The tension between them eased. She allowed it. He sat down slowly, legs crossed, heart still in disbelief. A living predator curled against him on a boat at sea. Not in a zoo, not behind glass. But here, with him. The wind picked up. The waves grew taller. He secured the sail, then brought another bowl of water to her side. She drank, then rested her head on his foot. For the first time, Thomas noticed the scars. Thin white lines behind her front legs, 2 bald patches along her spine, signs of confinement, of captivity. This wasn't just a leopard who had survived the ocean. This was a leopard who had survived humans. And now she was choosing to trust another one. Thomas blinked back a sting behind his eyes. "Okay," he whispered. "Then I'll protect you." And at that moment, surrounded by wind and wave, predator and man sat shoulder to shoulder, floating together toward a future neither could predict. But something inside both of them had already changed. By the 3rd day, the weather had shifted again. The storm system passed overnight, leaving behind pale skies and slow, rolling waves. The Morea sailed gently now, but Thomas's mind raced. They were running out of time. He had plotted a route to a protected bay along the Kenyan coast, but every part of him knew that arriving with a wild leopard on board was a death sentence. For her. She needed somewhere safe, remote, temporary. And then he remembered a speck on the chart. An old reef outpost, once used by marine researchers, abandoned years ago. No infrastructure, no officials, just a freshwater spring, a half-shelled building and shade. A place to think, to breathe. He adjusted the course. The leopard had grown more alert. She was eating now strips of smoked fish, a few emergency ration packs softened in water. She still limped, but the fire in her eyes had returned. And Thomas? He talked to her. Not like a pet, not like a curiosity, but like someone who had walked through the same fire. Maybe you came from a cage, he said once, as she rested beside him. Maybe I did too. Not with bars, but I know what it's like to survive things people don't believe. She would just blink, sometimes flick her ear, but she stayed close. When the island finally appeared on the horizon, it looked like a whisper, nothing but a green patch between sea and sky. No docks, no flags. Perfect. He anchored just offshore and took the inflatable dinghy to land, packing a waterproof bag with essentials: jerky, a portable water filter, tarp, and a machete. He returned for her. To his astonishment, she followed on her own. She stepped into the dinghy as if it were her boat, not his, sat facing the direction they were heading, calm, poised, like she understood. The sand was soft under their feet when they reached land. Thomas led her inland to the remains of the old station: cracked cement, a roof made of tin, and a deep stone basin that still collected rainwater. He laid the tarp near the shade, poured water, left food. She walked a small circle around the clearing, as if inspecting it, then returned to him and licked his hand. Just once. Then she settled into the grass, her body curling, eyes watching him as if to say, "This will do." Thomas dropped to his knees, overcome, not by fear, not even by relief, but by the truth. This wild, scarred leopard, thrown into the ocean like trash, had chosen to live and to trust. Not the world, but him. 3 days had passed on the island. Thomas had used what supplies he had to set up a makeshift shelter. Each morning, he rose before the sun to collect driftwood, check the rain basin, and tend to the small clearing where the leopard now moved with quiet confidence. She was healing. The limp had faded, her muscles had begun to fill out again, regaining the sleek, silent strength that belonged to the predator she was. But her eyes, those golden, watchful eyes, remained fixed on him every time he moved. Not out of threat, out of recognition. They were past survival now. They were in the space between wild and human, an impossible place where trust lived, but not forever. And Thomas knew it. He watched her climb the trees in the evening, stretch under the canopy like smoke winding through leaves. She was meant for movement, for solitude, for freedom that stretched on beyond any cage or clearing. But every time he tried to picture the day she'd vanish into the trees and never come back, his chest tightened. Because she wasn't just a leopard anymore. She was his storm survivor, his miracle, his companion in the middle of nowhere. He had begun calling her Safi, a Swahili name meaning pure. He never said it to her face. Didn't want to domesticate what should never be domesticated. But in his mind, it fit. She was raw, unfiltered survival, and she had reminded him how to feel human again. On the fourth night, he sat beside the fire. Safi lay stretched along the sand, tail flicking occasionally, watching the stars as if they held answers only she could read. Thomas whispered, "What happens now, girl?" No reply, of course, but in his gut, he felt the answer forming. She would leave, not out of rejection, but out of truth. Out here, nature wrote the script, and it was almost time for her next chapter. The following morning, the moment came. Thomas woke to silence, the kind of silence you can feel, a space where something used to be. He stepped outside, bare feet sinking into warm sand. The clearing was empty. The tarp still rustled faintly in the breeze. The rain basin still held water, but Safi was gone. He called out once, softly, not expecting an answer, and got none. He waited hours. Then, near sunset, he walked to the edge of the forest. one last time. He knelt there, tracing the patterns in the soil. Her paw prints were there, faint, leading away. Not in panic, not in flight, just forward. She had walked, not run. And he smiled. That night, he packed up his bag. The island had served its purpose for both of them. He would sail to Mombasa, tell no one. Say only that he'd lost cargo and been delayed by storm. And maybe, somewhere down the line, he'd find work again. In conservation, in education, in something that gave meaning to what he'd witnessed. Because once a leopard looks you in the eyes, trust you not as prey or captor, but as something in between. You don't go back to being who you were before. Not ever. Months later, deep in a protected forest along the Kenyan coast, a group of wildlife biologists documented something unusual. A leopard, female, solitary but unafraid of people, was spotted frequently near camera traps. Not aggressive, not timid. She avoided traps, avoided cages. But once, only once, she approached a field station and drank from a basin while researchers stood frozen. She looked at them, held their gaze, and vanished into the trees again. And in a small, quiet village near the sea, Thomas Avery sat under a tree, sketching wildlife for school children and teaching them about compassion and survival. And sometimes when the wind came in off the ocean, he'd glance toward the horizon and smile, because somewhere out there, Safi was still writing her story, and their chapter, impossible and unforgettable, would live with him forever. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who believes in second chances, because sometimes the wildest stories are also the most human, and sometimes a single act of kindness can rewrite the ending.